The silver spoon tapping against crystal sounded less like a toast and more like a gun cocking. My adoptive mother smoothed her custom Dior, addressing the Manhattan elite with a bored smile. "Let's be honest," she announced. "We didn't adopt her for love. We needed a massive tax deduction that fiscal year." As the room gasped, my husband squeezed my hand, but I wasn't shaking. I was waiting. I set this trap 10 years ago, and they just stepped right into it. My name is Samira Ravenswood, and for 29 years, I have existed as a carefully curated footnote in the glossy autobiography of the Hawthorne family, standing in the center of the grand ballroom at the Sterling Heights. I looked less like a bride and more like a crowning achievement in asset management. The venue was a cathedral of capitalism, a place where the air conditioning was set to a temperature that preserved orchids and froze conversations. Crystal chandeliers, each costing more than a median American household earns in 5 years, hung overhead like suspended guillotines. The light they cast was fractured, brilliant, and utterly devoid of warmth. I smoothed the silk of my gown, a garment that had cost $12,000 and had been selected not by me, but by my mother's personal stylist to ensure I complemented the table settings. It was a masterclass in branding. Everything in this room was branded. The napkins were embroidered with gold thread. The champagne was a vintage from 1996, chosen specifically because the bottle label matched the color scheme of the floral arrangements. And then there were the guests, 300 of Manhattan's most influential socialites, politicians, and corporate sharks sat at round tables, picking at plates of Chilean sea bass that had been flown in that morning. They weren't here for love. They were here because an invitation from Richard and Evelyn Hawthorne was a summons one did not ignore. I looked out at them, a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns, and I felt nothing but a cold, crystalline clarity. Beside me, Elias shifted his weight. My husband, the word still felt new, tasting like fresh bread in a mouth used to eating stones. Elias was not one of them. He was an architect who designed libraries and community centers, a man who looked at buildings and saw shelter rather than equity. He was the only real thing in a room constructed entirely of smoke and mirrors. He squeezed my hand beneath the table, his thumb tracing the line of my knuckles. His palm was warm, a stark contrast to the glacial atmosphere of the ballroom. "Just breathe," he whispered, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "They are just background noise. Samira, focus on me." I wished it were that simple, but tonight wasn't just a wedding. It was a stage play, and the final act was about to begin. My gaze drifted to the table of honor on my left. My adoptive parents, Richard and Evelyn Hawthorne, sat like monarchs presiding over a coronation. Richard was checking his watch, likely calculating the opportunity cost of the reception in relation to the Asian markets opening in a few hours. Evelyn was critiquing the waiter pouring her wine. Her lips pursed in that familiar expression of disappointed superiority. They looked impeccable. They looked powerful. They looked like people who had never been told no in their entire lives. And then there was Beatrice, my sister, or rather, the biological daughter of the Hawthorne dynasty. She sat 2 seats away from Evelyn, sipping her champagne with a look of bored malevolence. She was 25 years old and had never worked a day in her life, unless one counted the labor of spending her trust fund. Today, she had chosen to wear a dress of pale cream silk. It was technically not white, legally speaking, but under the harsh lights of the chandeliers, it was close enough to be an insult. It was a deliberate, calculated move to draw the eye, to remind everyone that while I might be the bride, she was the princess. She caught my eye and offered a small, sharp smile, raising her glass in a mock toast. "You look decent, Samira," she had told me earlier in the dressing room, scanning my face for flaws. "Though I suppose anything looks good when you spend enough money on it. Mom and Dad really pulled out all the stops to make you look presentable." I had not replied then. I would not reply now. The room buzzed with the low hum of gossip. I had spent a lifetime decoding the whispers of the elite, and I knew exactly what they were saying. I could read it in the way the senator's wife tilted her head toward the banker's husband. They were saying how lucky I was. They were discussing the charity of the Hawthorne family, how they had plucked a dark-skinned girl from the obscurity of the foster system and polished her into a diamond. They were speculating on whether Elias was a fortune hunter or if I was simply desperate to dilute my own muddy lineage with a respectable white professional. Samira really married up, I imagined them saying, even though Elias had more integrity in his little finger than this entire room combined. And Richard and Evelyn Saints, truly, to take in a child like that and give her a wedding like this? The irony was acidic enough to burn a hole through my stomach. If only they knew that the cost of this wedding was a tax write-off, categorized under public relations and charitable hosting in the corporate ledger. Sudden feedback from a microphone sliced through the ambient noise, silencing the room. The murmurs died down instantly. I stiffened. This was not in the schedule. The wedding planner, a woman with a headset and a clipboard who looked on the verge of a nervous breakdown, signaled frantically from the wings. But it was too late. Richard and Evelyn had taken the stage. They stood in front of the band, bathing in the spotlight that was meant for the first dance. Richard adjusted his tuxedo jacket, projecting the confident aura of a man about to announce a merger. Evelyn stood slightly behind him, her hand resting possessively on his arm, her face arranged into a mask of benevolent maternal pride. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests," Richard began, his voice booming with the practiced cadence of a boardroom orator. "If I could have your attention for a brief moment." Elias's grip on my hand tightened to the point of pain. "What are they doing?" he whispered. "I don't know." I lied. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were unable to let a moment pass without making it about themselves. But even I, with 10 years of planning behind me, was not prepared for the depth of the humiliation they were about to inflict. "Today is a joyous occasion," Richard continued, gesturing vaguely in my direction without actually looking at me. "We watch Samira embark on a new chapter, and it makes Evelyn and me reflect on the journey that brought us here. 22 years ago, we made a decision that changed the trajectory of our lives." He paused for effect. The room was silent. "Many of you know Samira as our adopted daughter," Richard said, his tone shifting to something more confidential, like he was sharing a stock tip. "But few of you understand the reality of that decision. We live in a world of numbers. My friends, a world of bottom lines." He chuckled, and a few sycophants in the front row chuckled with him, conditioned to laugh whenever a billionaire made a sound. "Let us be honest," Evelyn chimed in, leaning toward the microphone. Her voice was light, airy, and terrifyingly casual. "We did not adopt Samira because of an overwhelming biological urge. We did not do it because we were desperate for another child to fill the nursery. We already had our beautiful Beatrice." Beatrice preened in her seat, smoothing her cream-colored skirt. "We adopted Samira," Evelyn said, her smile widening to show perfect, veneered teeth. "Because in that particular fiscal year, Hawthorne Global needed a significant offset. We needed a charitable act that came with a very specific, very generous deduction." The air left the room. It vanished, sucked out by the sheer audacity of the statement. The silence that followed was not the respectful silence of a toast. It was the horrified silence of a witness to a crime. Richard took the lead again, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the shockwave he had just detonated. "It was a strategic acquisition," he said, using the terminology of a corporate takeover to describe the life of a human being. "By bringing Samira into our home, we were able to leverage a loophole in the dependency tax code of that era, allowing us to funnel nearly $4 million into a tax-exempt trust. It was, frankly, one of the best investments we ever made." He raised his glass, looking out at the crowd, expecting applause for his financial acumen. "So, here is to Samira, the little girl who saved us millions and helped us build the foundation you see today, to a return on investment that has finally matured." For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The guests were frozen. A fork clattered onto a plate somewhere in the back. the sound echoing like a gunshot. The cruelty was so naked, so casual, that the guests' people who laid off thousands of workers without blinking were stunned. They looked at me, they looked at the parents, they looked at their drinks. Then, slowly, hesitantly, a few people began to clap. It was a scattered, fearful applause, started by those who owed Richard money or feared his influence. Then a few more joined in, followed by nervous laughter. They were smoothing it over. They were accepting the narrative. "Oh, it's just Richard being Richard. It's just a joke. It's just business." Beatrice was laughing openly now, hiding her mouth behind a manicured hand, her eyes dancing with malicious delight. She looked at me, mouthing the word investment. I sat there, feeling the blood drain from my face, not from shame, but from a cold, concentrated rage that crystallized in my chest. Beside me, Elias was trembling with fury. He started to stand up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "That is enough," he hissed, ready to storm the stage and tear the microphone from Richard's hand. I clamped my hand over his wrist, anchoring him to the spot. "No," I said. My voice was steady. It did not sound like my own. It sounded like the voice of a judge delivering a verdict. "Sit down, Elias. Samira, did you hear what they just said? I'm not going to let them—" I said, "Sit down." I turned to him, and he stopped. He saw something in my eyes that he had never seen before. He saw the predator that I had hidden beneath the skin of a dutiful daughter for 2 decades. "This is not your fight, my love. It is mine." I released his hand. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at the guests who were now whispering feverishly, their pity transforming into morbid curiosity. I looked at the reflection of myself in the silver charger plate before me. I saw a woman who had been bought, sold, and itemized. I saw a woman who had been erased, and then I stood up. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a queen walking to the gallows to execute the executioner. I adjusted the bodice of my $12,000 dress. I smoothed the skirt over my hips. I lifted my chin. I did not cry. There were no tears left. I had shed the last of them when I was 12 years old and learned what the word liability meant. The room fell silent again as they watched me. They expected a scene. They expected the hysterical tears of the ungrateful adoptee, or perhaps the shattering of a glass, or a fleeing bride running through the double doors. They wanted drama. They wanted to see the cracks in the porcelain. I would not give them cracks. I would give them a demolition. I walked toward the stage. My heels clicked against the marble floor. A steady, rhythmic countdown. Click, click, click. Richard and Evelyn watched me come. Richard looked mildly annoyed, as if I were interrupting a board meeting. Evelyn looked amused, tilting her head as if wondering what the pet was going to do next. They had no idea. They thought they were the authors of this story. They thought I was a character they could write out whenever the tax benefits expired. I walked up the 3 steps to the stage. I stood between them. The heat of the spotlights hit my face, blinding and absolute. I reached out and took the microphone from Richard's hand. He let it go easily, surprised by my boldness, but too arrogant to perceive the threat. I turned to face the crowd. 300 faces, 600 eyes, all judging, all waiting. I took a breath. The air tasted of expensive perfume and rot. "Thank you, Mother. Thank you, Father," I said. My voice amplified, filling every corner of the ballroom. It was calm, terrifyingly calm. "For the first time in 29 years, you have finally told the truth." I paused, letting the words hang there, heavy and suffocating. "You are right," I continued. "I was an investment, a strategic acquisition, a tax break." I looked at Richard, then at Evelyn, and finally locked eyes with the camera crew that was live streaming the event to the family's social media channels. "But you forgot to tell them the rest of the story. You forgot to tell them what happens when an asset appreciates beyond your control." I gripped the microphone stand. The cold metal bit into my palm. It was time. "And you certainly forgot to mention," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming hard as diamond, That for the last 5 years, you have been using my name to launder money through a charity that does not exist. I smiled. It was the smile of the wolf at the door. Let's talk about the numbers, shall we? Richard stared at me. The microphone was gone from his hand, and his fingers were still curled around the empty space where it had been. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the benevolent billionaire slipped, revealing the confusion of an old man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath him was not solid earth, but a trap door. He blinked. Once, twice, he was waiting for me to scream. He was waiting for me to throw the microphone at him or dissolve into a puddle of weeping gratitude for his reluctant charity. That was the script he had written in his head. That was the scene he had rehearsed. But I did not scream. I did not weep. I stood tall in my silk and lace, a statue of retribution carved from the very money they had stolen. "Thank you," I repeated, my voice steady, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and the terrified silence of the guests. "Thank you for finally being honest. You have no idea how refreshing it is to hear you admit it out loud." A nervous titter ran through the crowd, quickly stifled. People were looking at each other, eyes wide, sensing that the entertainment had shifted from a light comedy to a blood sport. "You are right, Richard," I said, dropping the father entirely. "I was never a daughter to you. I was a deduction. I was a line item on a spreadsheet, nestled somewhere between capital depreciation and offshore assets. And you know what? I made peace with that a long time ago." I took a step closer to them. Evelyn flinched. It was a tiny movement, a subtle tightening of her jaw. But I saw it. I saw the fear beginning to bleed into her arrogance. "But you left out the most interesting part of the story," I said, my voice dropping to a confidential whisper that the microphone carried to the back of the room. "You told them why you adopted me, but you forgot to tell them why you kept me." The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the electricity of an impending storm. "You see," I addressed the crowd, sweeping my gaze over the faces of the bankers, the lawyers, the politicians. "My parents sorry. My investors are very good at math, but they are terrible at history. Specifically, the history of their own legal filings." I turned back to Richard. His face was reddening, a slow, mottled flush creeping up from his collar. "You forgot to mention that my legal guardianship under the Hawthorne estate ended 5 years ago," I said clearly, enunciating every syllable. "You forgot to mention that the power of attorney you claim to have over my finances expired the day I turned 25. Evelyn's eyes widened. Her hand flew to her throat, clutching her diamond necklace as if it were strangling her. "And yet," I continued, "despite having no legal right to my name, despite having no legal claim to my signature, you have opened 7 shell companies in the Cayman Islands under the name Samira Ravenswood in the last 3 years alone." The gasp from the audience was audible this time. It was the sound of 300 people realizing they were witnessing a felony in real time. "That is a lie," Evelyn shrieked. Her voice was shrill, shattering the carefully constructed atmosphere of elegance. She lunged forward, her hand reaching out to snatch the microphone from me. Her fingernails were painted a perfect, bloodless nude, and they looked like talons. She never reached me. Elias moved. He did not run. He simply materialized between us. A wall of black wool and quiet fury. He caught Evelyn's wrist in midair. He did not hurt her, but he did not let go. He held her hand away from me with the firm, unyielding grip of a man removing a drunk from a bar. "I believe she is still speaking." "Evelyn," Elias said. His voice was polite, almost gentle, but his eyes were hard as flint. "Let her finish." Evelyn stared at him, shocked that the architect, the nobody, the blue-collar distraction dared to touch her. She tried to pull her arm back, but he held it for a second longer than necessary, just to make the point clear. Before releasing her, she stumbled back into Richard, who caught her by the shoulders, his face now pale and slick with sweat. "This is absurd," Richard sputtered. trying to regain control of the room without a microphone. The girl is hysterical. She is off her medication. Security. Where is security? Security is not coming, Richard, I said into the mic, cutting him off effortlessly, because I am the one who paid the security firm for tonight. They work for me. I watched the realization hit him. The color drained from his face completely. You thought you were walking into a coronation, I said. You thought this was just another party where you could parade your charity case around and collect accolades for your generosity. But look around you. I gestured to the room. The guests were no longer eating. The waiters had stopped pouring wine. Every eye was fixed on the stage. I did not invite these people here to celebrate my marriage, I said. I invited them to be witnesses. My mind flashed back, unbidden, to the day I realized what I was. I was 10 years old. It was Christmas morning. Beatrice had received a pony a living, breathing pony that was currently destroying the manicured lawn of the estate. I had received a bond certificate. It was framed. Richard had handed it to me and told me not to touch it, not to break the glass, because it was for my future. I remembered sitting in the corner of the library, watching Beatrice ride her pony through the window, clutching the cold frame of the certificate. I remembered feeling heavy, not with sadness, but with the weight of value. I was not a child. I was a vault. I was a place where they stored things they did not want the government to see. The memory sharpened my focus. The little girl in the library was gone. The woman on the stage was done being a vault. She was about to open the doors and let all the secrets spill out. Witnesses to what? Richard hissed, leaning in close to me, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and fear. You ungrateful little brat. After everything we gave you. The clothes on your back. The roof over your head. The roof was a tax write-off, I replied, my voice amplified for everyone to hear. The clothes were a business expense. Do not pretend you gave me anything that you did not invoice later. I turned my attention back to the crowd. There is one table in particular I would like to acknowledge, I said, pointing a finger toward the back of the room, near the kitchen entrance. Table 9, heads turned. At table 9 sat 8 people. They were not dressed in designer gowns or bespoke tuxedos. They wore off-the-rack suits in shades of gray and navy. They did not look like socialites. They looked like accountants who had never smiled in their lives. They looked like people who read fine print for fun. My parents told you they were distant cousins from the Midwest, I said. They are not. Richard squinted into the darkness of the hall. I saw the moment he recognized one of the faces at the table. His knees buckled slightly. Who are they? Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. Samira, who are those people? I looked at her, for the first time all night. I felt a flicker of pity, not for her, but for the sheer magnitude of the delusion she had lived in. She truly believed she was untouchable. She truly believed that the laws of gravity and finance did not apply to people named Hawthorne. They are the people who are very interested in those shell companies. Mother, I said, they are very interested in the $5 million you moved through the Samira Education Fund last year, despite the fact that I finished my education 7 years ago. The guests at table 9 stood up in unison. It was a choreographed movement, terrifying in its synchronicity. I invited them, I said, because I wanted to make sure that when the truth came out, it was on the record. I wanted to make sure that this time, the numbers would add up. Richard was shaking his head, muttering to himself. No, that is impossible. The accounts are sealed. The trust is blind. The trust was blind, I corrected him, until I opened my eyes. I looked down at the crowd. The silence was absolute. It was a silence so profound you could hear the ice melting in the untouched glasses of champagne. You called me a strategic acquisition, Dad, I said, using the word like a weapon. You were right. I was strategic. I just wasn't yours. I leaned closer to the microphone for the final blow. Taxes are a tricky business, aren't they? I murmured. Especially when you cook the books using the name of a forensic accountant. I dropped the microphone, It did not make a screeching feedback noise. It hit the carpeted stage with a dull, heavy thud. The sound signaled the end of the world as the Hawthorns knew it. The silence that followed stretched out, elastic and agonizing. Richard stared at the microphone on the floor as if it were a grenade that had just landed at his feet. Evelyn let out a small, strangled sob, and in that silence, as the reality of my words began to sink into the minds of the elite, the present moment began to dissolve. The glitz of the ballroom faded. The smell of expensive flowers was replaced by the smell of lemon polish and old paper. The bright lights of the chandeliers dimmed into the cold, gray light of a winter afternoon in a house that was too big for love. I was no longer standing on the stage. I was back there, back where the ink on the ledger first started to dry, back to the beginning of the transaction. The first thing I remember about the Hawthorne estate is the temperature. It was always cold. It was a sterile, museum-quality chill designed to preserve oil paintings and antique tapestries, but it seemed to seep into the marrow of my bones and stay there. I was 7 years old when I walked through those mahogany doors, clutching a plastic bag that contained everything I owned in the world. I remember looking down at my shoes, scuffed and worn, standing on a marble floor so polished it looked like a frozen lake. I did not look like them. That was the first lesson. The Hawthorns were a study in pale elegance, all blonde hair, blue eyes, and skin the color of porcelain. Beatrice, my new sister, looked like a doll that had been taken straight out of a box. I, on the other hand, was a disruption to their color palette. My skin was the color of cinnamon, my hair a thick, unruly dark wave that refused to be tamed, and my eyes were almost black. I was of mixed Latin descent, a detail that was never explicitly discussed at the dinner table but was always present, like a heavy piece of furniture that everyone walked around but pretended not to see. I was not just a child to them. I was an aesthetic choice, a splash of diversity in their monochrome world. The rules of my existence were never written down, but they were etched into the air I breathed. Rule number 1 was gratitude. I was expected to be perpetually, performatively grateful. Every meal I ate, every piece of clothing I wore, every breath I took in that house was treated as a supreme act of benevolence on their part. Rule number 2 was performance. I was the scholarship student of the family. While Beatrice was allowed to be mediocre, allowed to get C's in math and quit piano lessons when she got bored. I had to be exceptional. I had to justify my presence. If Beatrice failed a test, it was the teacher's fault. If I failed a test, it was a squandering of the opportunity they had given me. But there was a catch to this rule, a cruel twist that I learned early on. I had to be smart. Yes, I had to be talented. Certainly. But I was never, under any circumstances, allowed to outshine Beatrice in public. I was the supporting actress who had to be good enough to make the production look professional, but not good enough to steal the scene from the lead. I remember my 8th birthday. It was 3 months after I arrived. I woke up with a knot of excitement in my stomach, wondering if there would be a cake, or perhaps a party like the one Beatrice had attended the week before. I went down to breakfast. There were no balloons. There was no cake. Beside my plate of grapefruit and dry toast sat a manila envelope. Richard sat at the head of the table, reading the Wall Street Journal. He lowered the paper and looked at me over his reading glasses. "Happy birthday, Samira," he said, his voice flat. "Open it." I opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of papers covered in dense legal text. I looked at him, confused. I was 8. I wanted a doll, or a bicycle, or maybe just a hug. "That," Richard said, pointing his fork at the papers, "is better than any toy. We have transferred a significant number of shares into a trust in your name. You cannot touch them, of course, not until you are much older, but you are now a stakeholder." "Thank you," I whispered, pushing the papers back into the envelope. "It is a sacrifice for us," Evelyn added, not looking up from her yogurt. "Capital gains taxes are punishing this year, but we do what we must for family." 6 months later, for Beatrice's birthday, they hired a circus. There were acrobats on the lawn, a carousel in the driveway, and a custom-made castle cake that was taller than I was. Beatrice received a diamond tennis bracelet. I stood on the periphery, holding a glass of sparkling cider, watching her open box after box of designer clothes and jewelry. When I caught Richard's eye, he gave me a stern look, a silent reminder of the conversation we had that morning. Don't look jealous, Samira. Jealousy is for the poor. You have your shares. Be grateful. I tried so hard to make them love me. I thought that if I could just be perfect enough, the coldness would thaw. I threw myself into self-improvement with the desperate energy of a drowning person trying to build a raft. By the time I was 10, I was fluent in Spanish and French, and I was starting on Mandarin. I practiced the violin for 3 hours a day until the skin on my fingertips blistered and calloused. I learned to eat with the correct fork. I learned to sit with my ankles crossed. I learned to suppress my laughter and my tears, flattening myself into a two-dimensional image of the perfect adoptee. But it was never enough. It was like pouring water into a bucket with no bottom. Beatrice sensed my desperation and fed on it like a parasite. She was 2 years younger than me, but she possessed an ancient, instinctive cruelty. She knew that in the hierarchy of the house, her word was law and mine was noise. I remember a rainy Tuesday when I was 11. I was in the drawing room, practicing a difficult concerto on my violin. Beatrice walked in, bored and looking for entertainment. She watched me for a moment, her eyes narrowing. That sounds terrible, she announced. I am practicing, I said, not stopping. She walked over to the mantel where Evelyn kept her collection of rare Ladro porcelain figurines. Beatrice picked up a delicate dancer, tossing it casually from hand to hand. Beatrice, put that down, I said, lowering my bow. Mom will be furious if it breaks. Oops, Beatrice said. She simply opened her hand. The figurine hit the hearth and shattered into a dozen pieces. The sound was sharp and final. Beatrice looked at me, and then she screamed. It was a blood-curdling shriek of fake terror. Samira? No! Evelyn came running in, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood. She stopped at the door, taking in the scene. The shattered porcelain, Beatrice cowering in the corner, pointing a trembling finger at me, standing there with my violin, frozen in shock. She hit it with her bow, Beatrice sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I told her to be careful, but she was swinging it around like a crazy person. Evelyn turned to me. Her face was a mask of cold fury. She did not ask me what happened. She did not look for evidence. The verdict had been delivered before the trial even began. I am so disappointed in you, Samira, Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet, which made it worse than shouting. After everything we have given you, to destroy our property, it is barbaric. I didn't, I stammered, tears stinging my eyes. Beatrice dropped it. I didn't touch it. Do not lie to me, Evelyn snapped. Beatrice would never break my things. Go to your room and leave the violin. Clearly, you do not appreciate the privilege of lessons. I spent the next 2 days in my room, staring at the ceiling, listening to Beatrice laughing in the hallway. That was the pattern. Beatrice was the golden child, innocent and pure. I was the wild variable, the charity case with the bad blood who needed to be tamed. But the moment that truly broke me, the moment that severed the last fragile thread connecting me to the idea of family, came the summer I turned 12. It was late August. The air was thick and humid. I had gone down to the library to find a book to read. The library was my sanctuary, the only place in the house where I felt safe. I was curled up in a wingback chair in the corner, hidden by a large potted fern. When Richard walked in, he was on the phone, his voice loud and booming. He didn't see me. No, Bob, you are not listening to me, Richard said, pacing back and forth. I need you to move the assets into the Ravenswood Trust immediately. The fiscal year ends in 2 weeks. He paused, listening to the person on the other end. I don't care about the audit risk, Richard barked. That is why we have the girl. The structure is solid, As long as the assets are legally titled to a minority dependent, the tax exemption stands. It is the perfect shelter. Bob. It is bulletproof. I stopped breathing. I sat very still, clutching my book to my chest. Look, Richard said, his voice dropping to a smug chuckle. The kid is a gold mine. We have funneled nearly $2 million through her accounts this year alone, between the adoption credits, the minority business grants we applied for in her name, and the tax-free growth on the trust. She is generating a better return than the tech portfolio. It's the best investment I've made in a decade. He laughed again. Yeah. We just have to keep her around until she's 18. Then we can figure out how to restructure. But for now, she is earning her keep. Even if she doesn't know it, he hung up the phone and walked out of the room, whistling a cheerful tune. I remained in the chair for a long time. The sun set, casting long, distorted shadows across the rows of books. The kid is a gold mine. She is generating a better return than the tech portfolio. Just have to keep her around. The words echoed in my head, rearranging my entire understanding of the world. I wasn't a daughter. It wasn't even a charity case. I was a product. I was a derivative asset. I was a human tax shelter. All the times Richard had told me to be grateful, all the times Evelyn had sighed about the cost of raising me, it was all a lie. They weren't spending money on me. They were making money off me. My existence, my name, my very identity was nothing more than a mechanism to keep their wealth intact. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't pain. It was something colder, harder. It was the feeling of molten iron cooling into steel. I stood up and walked to the window. I saw my reflection in the dark glass. The girl looking back at me was different. Her eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. That night, I made a decision. I would stop trying to make them love me. You do not ask a bank vault to love you. You do not ask a spreadsheet for a hug. I would stop crying over broken vases and missed birthday parties. If they wanted an investment, I would be an investment. I would be the best investment they ever had. I would be perfect. I would be silent. I would learn everything they knew. I would study their world, their rules, their language of money and manipulation. I would memorize every account number, every hidden transaction, every lie. I would grow in value, day by day, year by year. And then, when the time was right, when the investment had reached its maturity, I would cash out. I went to dinner that night and sat in my usual chair. Richard was cutting his steak. Evelyn was complaining about the maid. Beatrice was kicking me under the table. How was your day, Samira? Richard asked absently, not looking up. It was very educational. Father, I said. My voice was calm. I learned a lot. Good, he said, taking a sip of wine. We expect nothing less. I smiled at him. It was the first time I had ever smiled at him without meaning it. It was a fake smile, a mask, a weapon. I know, I said, and I promise, I will not let you down. I picked up my fork and began to eat. The food tasted like ash, but I swallowed it anyway. I needed my strength. I had a long game to play. College was not a period of self-discovery for me. It was a 4-year undercover operation, while my peers were rushing sororities and experimenting with their identities. I was sitting in the front row of advanced forensic accounting, taking notes with the precision of a court stenographer. I did not choose finance because I had a passion for markets. I chose it because it was the language of my captors, and I needed to be fluent if I was ever going to decipher the prison they had built around me. Richard and Evelyn were delighted. Of course, they saw my choice of major as another sign of my obedience, another step toward becoming a useful cog in the Hawthorne machine. They patted themselves on the back for raising such a practical, grounded daughter. They had no idea that every time I learned about tax loopholes, offshore structuring, and money laundering techniques, I was not thinking about how to help them. I was thinking about how to catch them. During my junior year, I made my move. I applied for a summer internship at Hawthorne Global. I did not ask Richard for a placement. That would have been too obvious. And I did not want to be the CEO's daughter who fetched coffee. I wanted to be invisible. I applied using my middle name, Maria, and used the address of my university dorm. The HR department, overwhelmed and underpaid, processed me as just another eager student from a good university. I was assigned to the archiving department, a windowless basement division that handled the digitization of decades-old physical records. It was the perfect place to bury a body, or in this case, a financial crime. For 6 weeks, I was a ghost. I wore oversized cardigans and glasses I did not need. I kept my head down. I scanned thousands of invoices, memos, and contracts. Most of it was mundane corporate detritus. But I had a system. I was looking for patterns. I was looking for my own name. I found it on a rainy Tuesday in July. I was digitizing a box of files labeled Miscellaneous Liabilities 2018 to 2020. I pulled out a thick folder bound with a red elastic band. The cover sheet read, Raven Shell Corp. 3. My heart hammered against my ribs. I flipped it open. There it was. My name, Samira Ravenswood, listed as the sole director and majority shareholder. I sat there in the humming silence of the server room, my hands trembling as I turned the pages. It was not just one company. There were 3. Raven Shell Corp. 3, Bluebird Logistics, and SR Holdings. On paper, I was a tycoon. I owned commercial real estate in neighborhoods that did not exist. I owned consulting firms that had billed Hawthorne Global for millions of dollars in services that were never rendered. But as I dug deeper, the horror set in. These companies were not assets. They were dumping grounds. They were loaded with toxic debt, high-risk loans, and transactions that looked suspiciously like bribes to foreign officials. Then I saw the signatures. At the bottom of a loan agreement for $2 million, there was a signature, Samira Ravenswood. It looped and curled exactly the way I signed my name. But I had never seen this document in my life. I looked at the date. I had been in a chemistry lab at university when this was signed. They had forged my signature. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was not just a tax break anymore. I was a scapegoat. The structure was designed with terrifying simplicity when not if, but when the IRS or the SEC finally looked too closely at Hawthorne Global. Richard and Evelyn would claim ignorance. They would point to the documents. They would point to the signatures. They would say that their adopted daughter, whom they had trusted, had gone rogue. I would go to federal prison for 30 years. They would walk away, shaking their heads in televised interviews, lamenting how they had tried their best to save me from myself. I needed help. I knew enough accounting to see the trap, but I did not know enough to dismantle it without triggering the alarm. That was when I found Joyce. Joyce Miller was a legend in the whispers of the accounting department. She had been a senior auditor for Hawthorne Global for 15 years until she was abruptly fired 2 years ago for gross misconduct. I found her living in a small, cluttered apartment in Queens, smelling faintly of cat litter and stale cigarette smoke. She did not want to let me in, but when I told her my name was Samira Ravenswood, she froze. She opened the door wide enough for me to slip inside. "I wondered when you would figure it out," Joyce said, pouring 2 cups of black coffee that tasted like battery acid. "Or if you ever would." "You know?" I asked. "I know enough," she said, lighting a cigarette. "I know that Richard Hawthorne is a crook who thinks he is smarter than the Treasury Department, and I know that he fired me because I asked why a 20-year-old college student was listed as the guarantor for a $5 million line of credit." Joyce became my mentor, my sensei in the art of corporate warfare. We met every Tuesday and Thursday night. She taught me how to read the metadata in digital files to prove date manipulation. She taught me how to trace wire transfers through a maze of shell companies. Most importantly, she taught me how to be a spy in my own home. "You need the source files," Joyce told me one night, stabbing the air with her cigarette. "The physical copies are good, but they can say you forged them. You need the digital originals. You need the emails where they discuss the forgeries, and those are on Richard's personal server." "The server is in his home office," I said. "He never leaves it unlocked." "Then you wait," Joyce said. "Everyone gets sloppy eventually. Arrogance makes people sloppy. I waited for 3 months. The opportunity came during the annual Hawthorne Christmas party. The house was filled with 200 guests. A string quartet was playing in the foyer. Waiters were passing around trays of caviar. Richard was in his element, holding court by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in one hand, telling a story about his golf game. Evelyn was busy judging the wives of junior executives. I slipped away. I went upstairs, my heart beating in my throat. The hallway was empty. I reached the door of the study. It was locked. I pulled a bobby pin from my hair. Joyce had taught me this too, not how to pick a lock like in the movies, but where Richard hid the emergency key. It was inside the hollow base of the bust of Julius Caesar that stood on the pedestal next to the door, a fitting hiding place for a man with a god complex. I found the key. I opened the door. The room smelled of leather and cigar smoke. I went straight to the computer. It was password protected. Of course. But Richard was a creature of habit. I tried his birthday. Incorrect. I tried his anniversary. Incorrect. Then I tried the date he took the company public. Access granted. I plugged in the high-speed USB drive Joyce had given me. It was encrypted and designed to look like a lip gloss tube. I started the transfer, my documents, financials, private, emails. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 10%? 20%? Downstairs. The music swelled. I could hear laughter. 40%. Samira. I froze. The voice came from the hallway. It was Beatrice. Samira, are you in there? I yanked the USB drive out at 80%. It was enough. I hoped it was enough. I shoved it into my bra and scrambled away from the desk. I grabbed a book from the shelf, a first edition of The Great Gatsby, and sat in the armchair just as the door handle turned. Beatrice walked in, looking suspicious. What are you doing? Mom is looking for you. She wants to take a family photo. I held up the book, forcing my hands to be steady, just looking for something to read. Beatrice, the party is a bit loud for me. She rolled her eyes. You are such a bore. Come on, don't embarrass us by hiding. I followed her out, my knees shaking with every step. I had the smoking gun pressed against my skin. But the war was not over. It was escalating. A month after the Christmas party, Richard and Evelyn invited me to a private dinner, just family. This usually meant they wanted something. We sat in the formal dining room. The table was set for 5. Samira, darling, Evelyn said, smiling that tight, shark-like smile. We have a surprise for you. We have invited the Sterling family to join us for dessert. You remember their son, Julian. I felt a cold pit open in my stomach. Julian Sterling was the fail son of one of Richard's shadiest business partners. He was 30 years old, had failed out of 3 law schools, and was currently facing a lawsuit for sexual harassment at his father's firm. Julian is a very spirited young man, Richard said, pouring wine. And the Sterlings are excellent partners. We have been discussing a merger of our interests. He looked at me pointedly. A merger that would be greatly solidified by a union between our families. They wanted to marry me off. It was the final step in the liquidation of the asset. By marrying me to Julian Sterling, they could legally transfer the toxic shell companies into a joint marital estate, effectively burying the evidence under a new layer of legal complexity. Julian's father would likely get a cut of the laundered money in exchange for taking the problem me off their hands. I am 22. Dad, I said, keeping my voice light. I want to focus on my career. I am not ready for marriage. Nonsense, Evelyn snapped. Julian is from a good family. It makes perfect business sense. You have a duty to this family. Samira, we saved you. Now you can help us secure the future. I will think about it, I said. You will do more than think about it, Richard said, his voice dropping to a growl. Dinner is on Friday. Wear the red dress, and be charming. I left the table feeling like the walls were closing in. They were accelerating the timeline. They knew the risks were growing, and they needed to offload the liability. I had the evidence. But I wasn't ready to strike. I needed more time to decode the encrypted files I had stolen. I needed a lawyer who wasn't on their payroll. I needed air. I ran to the library. Not the one in the house, but the public library downtown. It was the only place where I could breathe. I sat at a back table, buried under a pile of books on corporate law, trying to stop the panic attack that was clawing at my throat. "You are reading that upside down." I looked up. Standing there was a man with messy brown hair and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He was holding a stack of books on sustainable urban planning. He had kind eyes, not calculating eyes, not hungry eyes, just kind eyes. "What?" I said, wiping a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "The book," he said, pointing. "Title 26 U.S. Tax Code. You are reading it upside down. Although, honestly, it probably makes just as much sense that way." I laughed. It was a wet, jagged sound, but it was a laugh. "I'm Elias," he said, pulling out a chair. "Do you want to talk about why the tax code is making you cry? Or should we just sit here and pretend we are studying until they kick us out?" "I'm Samira," I said. For the first time in my life, I didn't add Ravenswood. I didn't think about my net worth or my debt-to-equity ratio. We talked for 3 hours. We didn't talk about money. We talked about architecture. He told me he designed spaces for people, not for profit. He told me about the community center he was trying to build in the Bronx. He looked at me, and he didn't see a portfolio. He saw a person. When I left the library that night, I knew 2 things. First, I was not going to marry Julian Sterling. Second, I had found something worth fighting for. Not just my freedom, but a life that was real, a life where love wasn't a transaction. But I also knew that time was running out. Richard and Evelyn were pushing for the engagement. Joyce had found something disturbing in the stolen files, a plan to liquidate the shell companies and file for bankruptcy in my name within the next fiscal quarter. I had to act. I had to finish the investigation. And I had to do it while planning a fake wedding to a man I loved, to trap the parents who hated me. The game was no longer just about survival. It was about total destruction. The first step of my liberation did not begin with a shout, but with a click. It was 3:00 in the morning on a Tuesday, the dead hour when the city of New York finally closes its eyes. I was sitting in my bedroom at the Hawthorne estate, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the walls I had stared at for 20 years. I was moving money. Technically, it was my money. My grandmother. Nana Rose, Richard's mother, and the only person in this bloodline who possessed a soul, had left me a substantial inheritance when she passed away during my freshman year of college. She had despised what her son had become, and in a final act of defiance, she had bypassed him entirely, leaving her personal fortune to the girl he bought, as she affectionately called me. Richard had tried to contest the will. Of course, he had raged and threatened, but Nana Rose had used lawyers who hated Richard almost as much as she did. The trust was ironclad. However, Richard still controlled the access. He had set up layers of bureaucratic red tape, requiring his countersignature for any withdrawal over $1,000. He thought this made him the gatekeeper. He forgot that I was the one who knew where the keys were kept, using the digital signatures I had harvested from his server. I initiated a series of transfers. I did not move the money to a local bank where he could freeze it. I moved it through a complex lattice of international accounts, first to a holding company in Zurich, then to a private equity firm in Singapore, and finally landing safely in an encrypted account in the Cayman Islands that only I could access. $2,400,000. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. The balance in the Hawthorne-controlled account dropped to 0. I closed the laptop. For the first time in my life, I was not just a line item, I was liquid, with my financial parachute secured. I began to build my professional identity. Richard believed I was working a lowly administrative job at a nonprofit, a lie I maintained by carrying a canvas tote bag and complaining about the subway. In reality, I had been hired as a senior risk analyst at Vanguard Analytics. Vanguard was not just a competitor to Hawthorne Global. They were our mortal enemies. They were the firm that specialized in forensic auditing and exposing corporate fraud. Getting hired there was like a wolf getting a job as a sheepdog. I worked under my middle name, Maria, and I wore colored contacts and dyed my hair a lighter shade of brown. I was good at my job. In fact, I was ruthless. I spent my days analyzing the weaknesses of companies exactly like my father's, learning every trick they used to hide their rot. When Richard found out I was working at Vanguard 6 months later, he nearly had an aneurysm at the dinner table. He did not know my title. Of course, he thought I was a secretary. "How dare you work for those vultures?" he had screamed, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table. "Do you have any idea what they do to men like me?" "It is just a filing job, Dad," I had replied, picking at my salad with feigned innocence. "I just need the health insurance. You know you stopped paying for mine." "Quit," he demanded. "I will not have a Hawthorne inside that building." "I can't," I said. "I signed a contract. If I quit now, I have to pay a penalty." He grumbled and cursed, but he let it go. He was too busy dealing with an SEC inquiry, an inquiry that, unbeknownst to him, had been triggered by an anonymous tip I had submitted from a burner phone 3 weeks prior. While I fought them in the corporate arena, I began the silent war for my legal autonomy. I hired a lawyer, a shark named Sarah, who specialized in emancipation and complex guardianship disputes. We met in coffee shops in Brooklyn, far from the prying eyes of Manhattan. We began filing the paperwork to permanently sever the financial guardianship Richard had tricked me into extending when I turned 18. It was a slow process, a game of inches, but every document I signed was a brick removed from the wall they had built around me. Then, they found out about Elias. I had tried to keep him a secret. Elias was too good, too pure to be dragged into the toxic orbit of the Hawthorne planetary system. But in the world of the surveillance elite, nothing stays hidden forever. A private investigator, hired by Evelyn to track my movements, snapped photos of us kissing in a park in the West Village. They staged an intervention. That was what they called it. I called it an ambush. "He is a nobody," Evelyn sneered, tossing the photos onto the coffee table. "An architect. He designs community centers. Samira. He makes in a year what I spend on handbags. He is using you." "He loves me," I said, standing my ground. "He loves the name," Richard corrected, pouring himself a scotch. "And we are done supporting this little rebellion. Break it off, or we cut you off. No more allowance, no more access to the apartments. You will be on the street." I almost laughed. I wanted to tell them that I had more liquid cash in the Caymans than they had in their checking accounts. I wanted to tell them that I was paying the rent on Elias's apartment and mine with my Vanguard salary, but I couldn't. Not yet. The trap wasn't ready, so I did what I had been trained to do since I was 7 years old. I performed. I let my shoulders slump. I let my eyes fill with tears. I made my voice tremble. "Please, Dad, don't do that. I have nowhere else to go." "Then do as you are told," Richard said. Satisfied by my submission, "Dump the loser, and focus on being a Hawthorne." "I will try," I stammered. "Just give me time to let him down gently." "You have 2 weeks," Evelyn said coldly. I did not break up with Elias. Instead, we went underground. We met in secret, using encrypted messaging apps and meeting in burrows where the Hawthorns wouldn't be caught dead. I played the part of the obedient, cowed daughter at home, apologizing for my transgressions, bringing them gifts, and acting terrified of their authority. It worked. They relaxed. They stopped watching me so closely. They thought they had broken me again, and in their arrogance, they got sloppy. For 2 years, I lived in the belly of the beast. I smiled at their parties. I nodded at their lectures, and every night, while they slept, I was working. I placed listening devices in the library. I cloned Richard's phone every time he left it unattended to charge. I recorded conversations where they discussed bribing zoning officials and falsifying environmental reports. I was building a dossier. It was thousands of pages long. It was not just a file. It was a coffin. The breaking point came in November. I was summoned to the study on a Sunday evening. Richard and Evelyn were there, along with Beatrice, Beatrice looked terrible. Her eyes were red, her mascara running, and she was shaking. "Sit down, Samira," Richard said. His voice was grave. I sat. "There has been a misunderstanding," Evelyn began, wringing her hands, "with the charity fund for the Children's Hospital." "What kind of misunderstanding?" I asked, though I already suspected. "Beatrice borrowed some money," Richard said quickly. $400,000. She intended to put it back. Of course, it was a short-term liquidity issue for her fashion line. She bought a villa in Tulum. "Didn't she?" I asked. Beatrice sobbed louder. "The point is," Richard snapped, "the auditors are coming next week. If that money is missing, there will be an investigation. Beatrice could face charges." "That is unfortunate," I said calmly. "It is more than unfortunate," Evelyn said. She slid a piece of paper across the desk toward me. "It is a catastrophe, unless we fix it." I looked at the paper. It was a confession. It stated that Samira Ravenswood, acting as the treasurer of the fund, a position I did not hold, had embezzled the money to pay for gambling debts. "What is this?" I asked, looking up at them. "It is the solution," Richard said. "You will sign this. We will repay the money immediately. So there is no actual loss. But we need a paper trail to explain the temporary discrepancy. You will take the blame. We have a judge in our pocket who will ensure you get probation. Maybe 6 months of community service. No jail time." "And Beatrice?" I asked, looking at my sister. "Beatrice has a public image to maintain," Evelyn said. "She is launching a perfume next month. She cannot have a felony on her record. You are sturdy. Samira, you can handle a little scandal. We will pay you, of course, $100,000 for your trouble." They were asking me to destroy my life to save Beatrice's reputation. They were asking me to become a felon for $100,000, while they sat on millions. It was the moment the last chain snapped. I stood up. I did not pick up the pen. "No," I said. The room went silent. Beatrice stopped crying. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I said no," I repeated. "I am not signing that. I am not going to prison for her, not for a villa in Tulum, not for anything." "You do not have a choice," Richard roared, slamming his hand on the desk. "You live under my roof. You eat my food. You are nothing without me." "I am everything without you," I said. I turned around and walked toward the door. "If you walk out that door, Samira," Evelyn shrieked, "you leave with nothing. We will burn you. We will ruin you." I stopped at the threshold. I looked back at them, these 3 people who had consumed my youth like a resource. "You can try," I said. I walked out. I went to my room, grabbed the single suitcase I had kept packed for 6 months, and walked out the front door. I did not take the clothes they bought me. I did not take the jewelry. I took my laptop, and I took a small, silver USB drive that was hanging on my keychain. That USB drive contained 20 years of tax evasion, wire fraud, bribery, and the specific details of how they had used my identity to steal $5 million from the federal government. I hailed a cab at the end of the driveway. "Where to, Lady Mutt?" the driver asked. "Federal Plaza," I said. "The FBI field office." I spent the next 3 months in a windowless room with 2 agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and a federal prosecutor. When I showed them the contents of the drive, the lead agent, a man named Miller, had actually whistled. "This is not just tax fraud," Miller had said, scrolling through the files. "This is a RICO case. This is organized crime." "I know," I said. "I want them to go down, all of them." "We have enough to arrest them now," the prosecutor said. "No," I said. "If you arrest them now, they will use their lawyers to drag this out for 10 years. They will spin the narrative. They will say I am a disgruntled daughter making up lies. I need them to confess. I need them to admit it in a way they cannot retract." "How do you propose we do that?" Miller asked. "I am getting married," I said. The plan was born. It was risky. It was theatrical. but it was the only way to ensure total victory. I would invite them. I would play the part of the daughter seeking reconciliation. I knew Richard's ego. He would not be able to resist a society wedding. He would not be able to resist the chance to grab the microphone and make the moment about himself. And when he did, when he felt safe and superior and untouchable, he would tell the truth. Because men like Richard Hawthorne did not think the truth could hurt them. They thought the truth was just another thing they could buy. I sent the invitations. I paid for the venue with my own money, the money Nana Rose left me. I hired the caterers. I hired the band. And at table number 9, I seated Agent Miller and 7 of his colleagues. I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room on the morning of the wedding. I looked at the woman in the white dress. She looked like a bride, but I knew better. I was not a bride. I was the bait. Richard laughed. It was not a joyful sound. It was a wet, throaty noise, like an engine trying to turn over in sub-zero temperatures. He adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous tick I had watched him perform 1,000 times during hostile takeovers, and stepped toward the edge of the stage. He looked out at the sea of stunned faces, his friends, his investors, his accomplices, and tried to sell them one last lie. "Oh, come now," Richard bellowed, forcing a wide, benevolent smile that did not reach his dead eyes. "Let us give Samira a round of applause for that creative performance. You know how she gets when she has had a little too much champagne. The poor girl has always been fragile, emotional. We have had her in therapy since she was 12, but some traumas run deep. Do they not?" He turned to Evelyn, seeking backup. Evelyn, pale but recovering her composure, nodded vigorously. "Yes, exactly," she chirped, her voice trembling only slightly. "She is off her medication again. We are so sorry you had to witness this breakdown. If the band could please play something upbeat, let us get back to the celebration." She waved her hand frantically at the DJ booth. A desperate conductor trying to silence a symphony of disaster. The DJ, a young man named Marcus, whom I had tipped $5,000 in cash earlier that morning, did not play music. He did not look at Evelyn. He looked at me. I stood center stage, watching my parents dance on the edge of the volcano. They thought this was a social faux pas. They thought they could spin this as a mental health episode, discredit the witness, and sweep the debris under the rug before the dessert course was served. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. The sound was crisp, cutting through the murmuring crowd. "Marcus," I said, my voice amplified and clear. "The slideshow, please, behind us." The massive LED screen that covered the entire back wall of the ballroom flickered. It had been displaying a looping montage of engagement photos Elias and me walking on the beach. Elias and me in Central Park images of a happiness that Richard and Evelyn had tried to destroy. The screen went black for a heartbeat. Then, it illuminated the room with a stark, blinding white light. It was not a photo. It was a PDF. Specifically, it was Internal Revenue Service Form 1040, Schedule C, filed for the tax year 2020. The room gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen right out of the ballroom. "What is that?" someone whispered in the front row. "That," I said, turning to point at the screen like a professor lecturing a class of slow students, "is the tax return for the Ravenswood Orphanage Initiative, a charity that, according to this document, provided housing and educational support for 300 underprivileged children in the Bronx." I walked over to the screen, my silhouette sharp against the glowing numbers. "According to this line here," I said, pointing to a figure that was highlighted in red, "my father, Richard Hawthorne, donated $12 million to this initiative, a donation that allowed him to completely offset the capital gains tax from the sale of Hawthorne Tech." I turned back to the crowd. Richard was frozen. His mouth was slightly open, a fish gasping on dry land. "There is just one problem," I said pleasantly. "The Ravenswood Orphanage Initiative does not exist. The address listed on the filing, it is a vacant lot in Queens that is currently being used as a storage yard for rusted shipping containers." "Turn it off!" Richard screamed. The mask had fallen completely now. His face was a mask of purple rage. Turn that damn thing off right now. He lunged toward the AV booth. But the screen changed again. This time, it was a bank statement. It was from the Bank of Nevis, an offshore account known for its discretion. The account holder was listed as S. Ravenswood. And here's where the money went, I narrated, my voice cool and professional. You see, Richard did not just invent a charity, he needed a place to park the cash where the IRS could not see it. So, he opened this account using my social security number and a forged passport. I zoomed in on the transaction log. $12 million in, I read. And then, look at these withdrawals. $2 million for a consulting fee paid to Beatrice Hawthorne, $3 million for the purchase of a yacht named the Golden Goose, and $5 million transferred to a shell company owned by O. This is interesting. I paused, letting the suspense build. I looked down at the second row of tables, where the board members of Hawthorne Global were sitting. Mr. Henderson, I said, locking eyes with the company's chief financial officer. I believe that is your signature on the receiving end of that transfer. Isn't it, Mr. Henderson, a man who had terrified me when I was an intern because of his ruthless cost-cutting measures, looked like he was about to vomit. He knocked over his wineglass as he tried to stand up, sending a red stain spreading across the white tablecloth like a fresh wound. That is a fabrication, Henderson stammered, his voice squeaking. I never signed that. Oh, but you did, I said. And I have the email chain where you discuss the structuring of the fee with my father. Would you like to see that next? Or should we skip to the part where you discuss how to bribe the state senator to rezone the waterfront property? The senator in question, sitting at table 4, suddenly found his napkin very interesting. He pulled it over his face, pretending to cough, signaling his bodyguards to prepare for an exit. Panic was beginning to ripple through the room like a contagion. These were people who understood risk, they understood liability, and they realized, with dawning horror, that they were not at a wedding, they were at an arraignment. You ungrateful bitch, Evelyn shrieked. She had abandoned all pretense of elegance. She grabbed a steak knife from the table nearest to her. We gave you a life. We gave you everything. She rushed the stage. It was a clumsy, desperate charge. She wasn't thinking. She was reacting with the feral instinct of an animal backed into a corner. Cut the feed, she screamed at the tech crew as she ran. I will fire all of you. I will sue you into oblivion. Turn it off. The tech crew did not move. They were young, underpaid freelancers whom I had treated with respect and paid triple their asking rate. They looked at Evelyn with a mixture of boredom and disdain. One of them, a girl with blue hair, simply put on her noise-canceling headphones and took a sip of her soda. Evelyn reached the stairs to the stage, but she couldn't climb them. Her knees gave out. She collapsed on the bottom step, sobbing hysterically, still clutching the steak knife but lacking the strength to lift it. Why? She wailed, looking up at me, her mascara streaming down her face in black rivers. Why are you doing this to us? Because you stole my name, I said, looking down at her. Because you made me an accomplice to a felony before I was old enough to drive. Because you looked at a child and saw a tax shelter. Then, from the side, came the real threat, Beatrice. My sister had been quiet during the presentation, likely processing the fact that her consulting fee was now public knowledge, but seeing her mother on the floor triggered something in her. She let out a scream of pure, unfiltered rage. I will kill you, Beatrice yelled. She charged from the left side of the stage. Unlike Evelyn, Beatrice was young and athletic. She moved fast. Her eyes locked on my throat. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to erase the source of her humiliation. The crowd gasped. Elias took a step forward, ready to intercept her. But I held up a hand. I did not need saving. Beatrice hit the first step. Her dress, a custom-made creation of cream silk with a train that was 3 feet too long, caught on the heel of her stiletto. Physics took over. She didn't just trip. She flew. It was almost graceful in its disaster. She pitched forward, arms flailing, and landed face first on the stage with a wet, heavy smack that echoed through the microphone system. She slid a few feet, coming to a stop right at the toes of my wedding shoes. The room went silent. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single person laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of amusement. Then another, then another. Beatrice pushed herself up. Her nose was bleeding. Her perfect hair was a rat's nest. The front of her expensive dress was smeared with stage dust and blood. She looked up at me, eyes wide with shock and pain. She looked small. She looked like the child who used to break toys and blame me. Only this time, there was no one to blame. "You ruined my dress," she whimpered. "You ruined your life," I corrected her. "I just turned on the lights." I stepped over her. I walked past Evelyn, who was still sobbing on the stairs. I walked straight up to Richard. He was leaning against the podium, breathing heavily. His face was gray. He was clutching his chest, playing the health card, hoping to garner sympathy, but nobody was rushing to help him. The sharks in the room smelled blood, and they knew he was the wounded seal. "You cannot prove intent," Richard wheezed, staring at the screen where his financial crimes were scrolling by like the credits of a movie. "I have lawyers. I have the best lawyers in New York. We will bury you in paperwork for 50 years. You will never see a dime." He was still trying to negotiate. He still thought this was a business deal gone wrong. "I do not want your money, Richard," I said, standing toe-to-toe with him. "I have my own money. I made it working for Vanguard. You remember Vanguard? The company you said was full of vultures." His eyes widened. "You gave them the files." "I gave them everything," I said. "Every email, every invoice, every recording of you bragging about how clever you were to use an orphan as a debit card." I leaned in close. I wanted him to hear this. I wanted him to remember this moment for the rest of his life, which he would likely spend in a federal facility with very poor lighting. "You spent 20 years telling me I was an investment," I said, my voice low and hard. "You told me I was a strategic acquisition. You told me I was an asset class." I gestured to the screen, where the final total of $50 million in embezzled funds was blinking in neon red. "Well, Dad," I said, "I ran the numbers, and it turns out the liability outweighs the asset." I reached out and adjusted his crooked bow tie. He flinched, terrified that I might strike him. "You said I was a tax contract," I whispered. "Today, I am liquidating the contract." I turned away from him and looked at the crowd. They were mesmerized. They were witnessing the live dissection of a dynasty. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice returning to the pleasant, hosting tone of a bride. "I apologize for the interruption to the festivities. However, I believe some of you might want to check your own portfolios, because if you did business with Hawthorne Global in the last 10 years, chances are your signatures are on that screen too." The room erupted into chaos. People began pulling out their phones, frantically calling their lawyers. The partners at the Hawthorne table were shouting at each other. The senator was sprinting for the exit. It was pandemonium. It was beautiful. But I wasn't done. The business part of the evening was concluded. Now, it was time for the legal proceedings. I looked toward table 9. The 8 men in the cheap suits were already standing. They were moving toward the stage, weaving through the panicked billionaires with the focused determination of wolves closing in on a herd. I caught the eye of the lead agent, Miller. He gave me a small, grim nod. It was time to close the deal. The room had settled into a vibration of terrified anticipation, the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster, the chaotic energy of the previous moment. With Beatrice sprawled on the floor and Evelyn sobbing on the stairs, had curdled into something far more dangerous. The guests, those captains of industry and doyens of society, were no longer looking at the drama on the stage. They were looking at the 8 men who had risen from table 9. These men did not move with the casual, fluid grace of the socialites around them. They moved with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a glacier. They navigated between the round tables, ignoring the horrified stares, their eyes locked on one target, Richard Hawthorne. I raised the microphone to my lips one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Earlier this evening, my father introduced the guests at Table 9 as distant cousins from the Midwest. He told you they were family. He lied. The lead man, the one I knew as Agent Miller, reached the foot of the stairs. He was a man composed of sharp angles and gray wool, with eyes that had seen every trick a desperate millionaire could pull. He stopped, reached inside his jacket, and pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open. The gold badge inside caught the light of the chandeliers, flashing like a warning beacon. "These men are not my cousins," I continued, watching Richard's face crumble from arrogance into ash. "Allow me to introduce Special Agent Miller and his team from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, and behind him, United States Assistant Attorney Vance from the Southern District of New York." A collective gasp, louder and more desperate than the previous ones, sucked the air out of the ballroom. In this room, hearing the words Internal Revenue Service was worse than hearing serial killer. A serial killer might kill you, but the IRS would audit your grandchildren. Richard stumbled back against the podium. He looked small. For all his bluster, for all his tailored suits and power plays, he was suddenly just an old man facing the consequences of his own greed. "This is a setup," Richard sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You cannot do this. This is a private event. You have no jurisdiction here." Agent Miller walked up the stairs. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply ascended, step by step, an embodiment of the law. He stopped 3 feet from Richard. "Mr. Hawthorne," Miller said. His voice was not amplified, but in the dead silence of the room, everyone heard him. "We have a federal warrant for the arrest of Richard Hawthorne and Evelyn Hawthorne on charges of tax evasion, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and filing false instruments with a federal agency." "Warrant," Richard laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "On what grounds you have no proof? My books are impeccable. My lawyers will have your badge for this." Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black device, a digital recorder. The red light was still blinking. "We have been recording for the last 2 hours. Mr. Hawthorne," Miller said calmly. "Specifically, we have a very clear recording of your speech from 20 minutes ago, the one where you explicitly stated, in front of 300 witnesses, that you adopted a child for the sole purpose of securing a tax deduction and used her identity to create a fraudulent charitable trust." Richard froze. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the recorder, then at me, then at the crowd. He realized, finally, the magnitude of his mistake. He had thought he was boasting to his peers. In reality, he had been confessing to the police. That was a joke," Richard whispered, the fight draining out of him. "It was a wedding toast, a metaphor." "Juries do not usually find tax fraud funny," Miller said. He turned to his team. "Secure the scene. Nobody leaves until we have identification. I want the servers from the house seized immediately." 2 agents moved toward Richard. 2 others moved toward Evelyn, who was still sitting on the stairs. When she saw them coming, she scrambled backward, crab-walking up the steps in a panic. "No! No!" Evelyn screamed, pointing at Richard. "It was him. It was all him. I did not know anything. I just signed what he told me to sign. I am a victim here. He forced me." "Evelyn!" Richard roared. Betrayed. "You came up with the idea for the Cayman accounts." "Liar!" she shrieked back. "I am just a housewife. I do not know anything about finance officer. Please, look at me. Do I look like a criminal? You look like the co-signatory on a fraudulent account that laundered $12 million. Mrs. Hawthorne," one of the agents said, reaching for her arm. "Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." The sight of Evelyn Hawthorne, the woman who had once fired a maid for making eye contact, being hoisted to her feet and handcuffed, was an image that would be burned into the retinas of Manhattan society for a generation. But I was not done. There was one more nail to drive into the coffin. One final piece of the trap that I had engineered with the cold precision of the vanguard analyst I had become. "Wait," I said. The agents paused. Richard, now handcuffed and sagging in the grip of two federal officers, looked up at me with hatred burning in his eyes. "You have destroyed us," he spat. "Are you happy now? You have sent us to prison. But you get nothing. Samira, nothing. The government will seize everything. The house, the accounts, the company. You will be just as penniless as we are." I smiled. It was a genuine smile this time. "Actually, Richard," I said, "that is not entirely accurate." I walked over to the podium where he had stood. I opened the folder I had left there earlier. I pulled out a document printed on heavy, bonded paper. "You see, about 6 months ago, Hawthorne Global started having liquidity problems," I said, addressing the room. "You were over-leveraged. You had borrowed heavily against the company assets to fund your lifestyle and cover the holes in the shell companies. The banks were getting nervous. They wanted to sell the debt." Richard went pale. He knew this. It was a secret he had kept from everyone, even Evelyn. "The debt was classified as distressed," I explained. "High risk. Nobody wanted to touch it, except for a small anonymous hedge fund called Aurora Holdings." I held up the document. "Aurora Holdings bought the debt for 40 cents on the dollar," I said. "They bought the senior secured loans. They bought the mortgage on the Hawthorne estate. They bought the lien on the corporate headquarters." I walked down the stairs, stopping right in front of Richard. "Do you know who owns Aurora Holdings, Dad?" He stared at me, shaking his head slowly. No, that is impossible." "It is amazing what you can do with a clean inheritance and a few smart investments in the futures market," I said softly. "I own Aurora Holdings, which means I own your debt, all of it." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that was intimate and lethal. "I am your biggest creditor, Richard, and according to the terms of the loan agreement, the moment you are indicted for a felony which just happened, the loan is in default. It is callable immediately." "You own the house," Evelyn gasped, her eyes wide with horror. "I own the house," I confirmed. "I own the cars. I own the artwork on the walls. I own the silverware you ate dinner with tonight. I own the clothes on your back. Technically." I stood up straight and addressed the agents. "Agent Miller, feel free to seize whatever assets you need for the criminal case, but please be careful with the furniture. I plan to sell it at auction next week to fund a scholarship for foster children." I turned back to my parents. "Your assets are frozen," I said. "Your credit is destroyed, and your reputation is gone. Take a good look around. Richard, take a look at the crystal, the champagne, the flowers. Breathe in the air conditioning." I gestured to the ballroom. "This is the last luxury party you will ever attend. Enjoy the memory of it. It will have to keep you warm for a very long time." Richard sagged in the agent's grip. His legs gave out completely, and they had to hold him up by his armpits. He looked broken, not just defeated, but hollowed out. The arrogant billionaire was gone, replaced by a terrified old man who had realized that the game was over and he had lost everything to the player he underestimated. Then, the final brutality occurred. Not from me, but from their friends. As the agents began to march Richard and Evelyn toward the exit, dragging them past the tables of their peers, a strange phenomenon occurred. The guests recoiled. It was a physical reaction. Men in $3,000 suits scrambled backward, knocking over chairs to get away from the aisle. Women pulled their skirts in tight, turning their faces away, shielding their eyes as if Richard and Evelyn were carrying a highly contagious plague. "George," Richard called out to a man at table 3, a banker he had known for 30 years. "George, call my lawyer. Tell him to meet us at the precinct." George did not look up. He was staring intently at his phone, typing a message, likely to his own compliance department to distance himself from Hawthorne Global. "Susan," Evelyn cried out to her best friend. "Susan, please take care of the dogs. Please." Susan turned her back completely, pretending to examine a flower arrangement. Nobody moved to help them. Nobody offered a word of comfort. These were people whose loyalty was tied exclusively to power and net worth. Richard and Evelyn had just lost both in the span of 10 minutes. They were no longer useful. They were liabilities. And in this world, liabilities were discarded. I watched them go. I watched my parents being led away in handcuffs, stumbling through the debris of their own hubris. I watched the flashbulbs of the press photographers whom I had tipped off an hour ago explode outside the glass doors of the lobby, capturing their shame for the morning edition. The ballroom was silent again. The agents had left with their prisoners. The screen behind me was still glowing with the evidence of their crimes. I stood alone on the dance floor. My wedding dress felt heavy, weighed down by the history it had been designed to conceal. Then, a hand touched my shoulder. I turned. It was Elias. He had been standing on the sidelines, letting me fight my battle. But now he was there. He didn't look at the guests. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at me. "Are you okay?" he asked. I looked at the empty doorway where my parents had vanished. I took a deep breath. The air in the room still smelled of expensive perfume and fear. But under that, I could smell something else. I smelled the rain. I smelled the street. I smelled the clean, sharp scent of a slate that had been wiped clean. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think I am finally done being a deduction." I looked around at the guests, who were now huddled in small groups, whispering frantically, casting fearful glances in my direction. They were terrified of me. They knew I had the files. They knew I knew their secrets too. "We should probably ask them to leave," Elias said, eyeing a senator who was trying to sneak out through the kitchen. "No," I said. "Let them stay for a moment. Let them sit in the discomfort. It is good for them." I walked over to table 9, which was now empty except for a few half-eaten bread rolls. I picked up a glass of wine that Agent Miller had left untouched. I raised it to the empty room. "To family," I whispered, and then I drank. The ballroom had dissolved into a theater of the absurd. The elegant veneer of the Sterling Heights was shattered, replaced by the raw, ugly noise of a dynasty screeching as it hit the pavement. Richard Hawthorne was not going quietly, as the reality of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. The shock that had initially paralyzed him gave way to a frantic, feral desperation. He was a man who had spent 40 years believing that every person had a price, that every law was a suggestion, and that every problem could be solved with a checkbook. He simply could not process a world where his money had no currency. He dug his heels into the carpet, physically resisting the 2 federal agents who were attempting to steer him toward the exit. He twisted his body, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting around the room looking for a lifeline that was not there. Wait, just a minute," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. He leaned in toward Agent Miller, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hiss that was loud enough for half the room to hear. "Officer, agent, listen to me. You look like a smart man. You look like a man who understands value." Agent Miller did not blink. He kept his grip firm on Richard's elbow. "Keep walking. Mr. Hawthorne." "No, listen," Richard pleaded, saliva flying from his lips. "I have an account in Zurich. It is not on the books. It is clean. There is $500,000 in it. Cash, untraceable." The crowd gasped again. Even in his downfall, Richard could not stop incriminating himself. He was digging his grave with a golden shovel. "I can give you the access code right now." Richard hurried on, his eyes wide and manic. 500,000, just for you. All you have to do is walk away. Just let us go out the back door. Nobody has to know. We will be in a private jet to Montenegro by morning." Agent Miller stopped. He looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and professional disgust. "Mr. Hawthorne," Miller said, his voice flat, "you just attempted to bribe a federal officer in front of 300 witnesses and a team of prosecutors. I am adding that to the charge sheet. That is another 15 years. Richard's face went slack. The realization that he was powerless was a physical blow. He sagged, letting out a low, keen sound of despair. But while Richard was bargaining, Beatrice was raging. She had pulled herself up from the floor, her cream dress ruined, her nose bloody. The humiliation had stripped away her socialite polish, revealing the spoiled, vicious child beneath. She did not care about the police. She did not care about the guests. She only saw me. She lunged at me again. But this time, Elias stepped in front of me. She stopped, breathing heavily, her hands curled into claws. "You did this!" she screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. "You poisonous, jealous bitch. You destroyed this family. You ruined everything." I stepped out from behind Elias. I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to see that I was not afraid. "I did not destroy this family. Beatrice," I said calmly. My voice was steady, a sharp contrast to her hysteria. "I only destroyed the lies. The family you are mourning never existed. It was a corporation, and it just went bankrupt. We gave you a home," Beatrice shrieked, tears cutting tracks through the blood on her face. "We let you live with us. We let you be one of us, and this is how you repay us, by burning it all down." "I am not burning it down," I replied. "I am just turning off the gaslight." "I hate you," she wailed, stomping her foot like a toddler. "I wish we had left you in that orphanage. I wish you had rotted there." "I know," I said softly. "But then who would have paid for your villa in Tulum?" Beatrice opened her mouth to scream again, but she was cut off by a sound that was even more pathetic. Evelyn. My adoptive mother had realized that screaming was not working. She had realized that anger was not working. So, she switched to the only other weapon she had in her arsenal: manipulation. She threw herself toward me. The agents holding her were taken by surprise, and she managed to break free for a second. She did not attack me. She fell to her knees. She crawled the last few feet, reaching out to grab the hem of my wedding dress. Her hands were shaking. Her face was a ruin of smeared makeup and terror. "Samira," she sobbed, looking up at me with wide, wet eyes. "Samira, baby, please, look at me. It is Mommy." A ripple of unease went through the crowd. It was a grotesque display. "Please, darling," Evelyn begged, clutching the silk of my skirt. "Tell them to stop. Tell them it was a mistake. You can fix this. You are so smart. You have always been the smart one. You can make this go away." I looked down at her. I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just a cold, clinical detachment. I was looking at a stranger. "I cannot fix this, Evelyn," I said. "The law does not work like that." "But we raised you," she cried, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "Doesn't that count for anything? We took you in when nobody else wanted you. We fed you. We clothed you. We gave you piano lessons. We gave you a life of privilege." She was reciting the ledger again, even in her begging. She was itemizing her investment. "You owe us," she wept, "after all the sacrifices we made, all the love we gave you." That word love snapped something inside me. It was the one lie I could not let stand. I reached down and peeled her fingers off my dress. I did it gently, but firmly, like removing a leech. "Love," I repeated. I crouched down so my face was level with hers. I wanted her to see my eyes. I wanted her to see the reflection of her own cruelty. "Let us talk about that love, Mother," I whispered. "Do you remember the winter when I was 9? I asked. "The heating broke in my room. It was 10 degrees. I asked you for an extra blanket. You told me that heating was expensive and that I needed to learn resilience. I slept in my coat for 3 weeks. Beatrice had a heated floor in her bathroom." Evelyn flinched, her eyes darting away. "Do you remember the library?" I continued, my voice relentless. "Do you remember the times you locked me in there for entire weekends because I forgot to say thank you for a glass of water? You told the staff not to feed me. You said hunger would teach me gratitude. I was trying to teach you manners," she stammered. "And let us not forget the numbers," I said. "You did not raise me, Evelyn. You did not nurture me. You checked my grades to make sure your asset was appreciating. You checked my appearance to make sure your prop was presentable. And you checked my signature to make sure your money laundering scheme was secure. I stood up, towering over her. That is not parenting, I said, my voice ringing out across the silent ballroom. That is livestock management. You were not raising a daughter, you were farming a tax deduction. Evelyn collapsed back onto her heels, sobbing into her hands. She had no defense. The truth was a mirror she could not bear to look into. Get them out of here, I said to the agents. The agents moved in. They hauled Evelyn to her feet. She was dead weight now, a broken doll in a designer dress. They grabbed Richard, who was staring at the floor, muttering about his lawyers. Then, the doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. It was not more guests. It was a tactical team. Uniformed officers from the Economic Crimes Unit swarmed into the room. They were there to secure the physical assets, to ensure that nothing was removed from the premises, but their arrival signaled something else. It signaled that this was not just an arrest. It was a raid. Richard Hawthorne, Evelyn Hawthorne, a sergeant barked. You are being taken into custody for federal racketeering and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. The procession began. It was an image that belonged on the front page of every newspaper in the country, and I had ensured that it would be. I stood on the stage, elevated, bathed in the soft white light of the chandeliers. My wedding dress was pristine, a column of white silk that glowed against the dark backdrop of the stage. I looked like a statue of justice. Below me, in the aisle, my parents were being dragged away. Richard was bent over, his tuxedo jacket torn, his face gray. Evelyn was weeping loudly, her heels dragging on the carpet. They were flanked by federal agents in windbreakers that said IRS, CID in bold yellow letters. They had to walk the gauntlet. They had to walk past the 300 people they had spent their lives trying to impress. I watched the guests. Some of them looked away, unable to watch the carnage. But most of them watched. They watched with the morbid fascination of people seeing a car crash. They watched the king and queen of the ball being dethroned and shackled. As they reached the double doors at the entrance of the ballroom, I signaled to the security team I had hired. Open the main doors, I said into my headset. Let the light in. The security guards threw open the heavy oak doors that led to the main lobby of the hotel, and the world exploded. I had tipped off the press. I had not just called a few reporters. I had leaked the location and the time of the event of the century. Every major network, every tabloid, every financial blog was waiting in that lobby. The moment the doors opened, a wall of flashing lights hit Richard and Evelyn. It was blinding. A cacophony of shouting erupted. Mr. Hawthorne, is it true you embezzled $50 million? Mrs. Hawthorne, did you really frame your adopted daughter? Look this way. Look this way. Richard tried to shield his face with his cuffed hands. But it was useless. The cameras captured everything. They captured the fear. They captured the handcuffs. They captured the utter, total defeat. I stood on the stage and watched them disappear into the sea of flashbulbs. I watched the agents push them through the mob and out toward the waiting police cruisers. They were gone. The doors swung shut, muffling the roar of the press, but the energy in the room remained electric. I looked down at the foot of the stage. Beatrice was still there. She was the only one left. The agents had not arrested her. She was not a signatory on the accounts. She was too incompetent to be a co-conspirator. She was merely a beneficiary. She stood there, shivering, looking at the closed doors where her parents had just vanished. She looked like a child who had lost her balloon. She looked up at me. Her eyes were full of hate, but also full of a new, terrifying realization. They took them, she whispered. Yes, I said. What about me? She asked. Her voice was small. I didn't sign anything. I didn't do anything. That is true, I said. You are not going to jail, Beatrice. She let out a breath, a small sound of relief. She straightened her spine, a ghost of her old arrogance returning. Good, then I will sue you. I will get the lawyers, and I will take back the house. I will take everything back. I almost laughed. It was tragic how little she understood. Beatrice, I said, stepping down from the stage until I was standing right in front of her. You do not understand. There is no house. There is no money for lawyers. I own the debt, and the government has frozen the assets. The accounts are zero. I have my trust fund, she argued. The trust fund was funded by the shell companies, I said. It is proceeds of crime. It is being seized as we speak. I reached into the pocket of my dress, a hidden pocket I had insisted the tailor add, and pulled out a $20 bill. I held it out to her. This is for a cab, I said. Although, to be honest, it probably won't get you very far in Manhattan. You might want to take the subway. Beatrice stared at the money. She stared at me. You are leaving me with nothing, she whispered. I am your sister. No, I said. You were the biological daughter. I was the tax break. Remember, I pressed the bill into her limp hand. You are 25 years old. Beatrice, I said. You have a college degree that Daddy bought for you. You have your health. You are not going to prison. I leaned in close. You are free, I said. For the first time in your life, you actually have to survive on your own merit. Consider it my final gift to you. I don't know how to do anything, she cried, panic rising in her voice. I have never had a job I don't know how to work. I smiled. It was a hard smile, forged in the fires of my own survival. Then I suggest you learn, I said. I hear Starbucks is hiring. They offer great benefits. I turned my back on her. Security, I called out. Please escort Miss Hawthorne off the premises. She is disturbing the guests. 2 large men in black suits stepped forward. Beatrice looked at them, then at me, then at the $20 in her hand. She realized that screaming would do no good. She realized that for the first time. Her last name meant nothing. She turned and walked away. She did not look back. She walked out of the ballroom, past the staring guests, and into a world that she was entirely unprepared to face. I was alone on the dance floor. The music was gone. The parents were gone. The sister was gone. I looked at Elias. He walked over to me, stepping over the spot where Beatrice had fallen. He took my hand. Is it over? He asked. I looked at the empty stage. I looked at the screen, which had finally gone black. The show is over, I said. Now, the cleanup begins. The silence that followed the exit of the Hawthorne dynasty was heavy, but it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that fills a room after a violent storm has passed. Leaving the air stripped clean and electrically charged, the guests remained in their seats, frozen like statues in a museum of avarice. Unsure of the new rules of engagement, they looked at the empty stage. They looked at the closed doors, and then, slowly, inevitably, they looked at me. I stood in the center of the ballroom, my white dress stark against the dark carpet. I was no longer the tax deduction. I was no longer the charity case. I was the person who held the keys to the vault, and in their world, that made me God. A shift occurred. It started at table 4. Mrs. Vanderbilt, a woman who had once asked me to fetch her a drink because she mistook me for the help, stood up. She smoothed her skirt and walked toward me, a smile plastered on her face that was so wide it looked painful. Samira, darling, she exclaimed, her voice dripping with sudden syrupy affection. My goodness, that was intense, but you handled it with such grace. Truly, I always told Richard you were the sharpest one in the family. She reached out to take my hand. I did not move. I let her hand hover in the air, unacknowledged. Mrs. Vanderbilt, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of my new authority. I believe you have a flight to catch. Her smile faltered. Excuse me. The private jet you share with the Hamiltons, I said. I recall you mentioning earlier that you hate staying in the city on weekends. Please, do not let me keep you. She blinked, confused by the dismissal. But surely we can stay for a drink to celebrate your liberation. This is not a celebration for you, I said. This is a private event, and you are no longer on the guest list. I signaled to the head of security, a large man named David who had been waiting for my cue. David, please escort Mrs. Vanderbilt to her car, and anyone else who is not family or a personal friend of the groom. The message rippled through the room. The sycophants, the climbers, the people who had laughed at Richard's jokes and ignored my existence for 20 years, they were being purged. They stood up, indignant, muttering about rudeness and how ungrateful she is. But they moved. They knew power when they saw it, and they knew they had none here. Within 20 minutes, the ballroom was transformed. The 300 guests had been whittled down to 50. The people remaining were different. There were Elias's parents, confused but supportive, holding hands at table 12. There were his college friends, who had taken off their ties and were already attacking the open bar. There were the few friends I had made at Vanguard, people who knew the real me, not the Hawthorne construct. The air changed. It became lighter. The suffocating pressure of judgment evaporated, replaced by the genuine murmur of conversation. I walked over to the band leader, who looked terrified that he was about to be fired too. Play, I said. Something real. No more classical waltzes. Play jazz. Play soul. Play something with a heartbeat. He nodded frantically and counted off. The band launched into a soulful rendition of At Last, and the room finally exhaled. I walked out to the balcony. I needed to breathe air that hadn't been recycled through a ventilation system paid for by fraud. The night air was cold and crisp, smelling of rain and the Hudson River. Elias found me there. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood beside me, leaning his elbows on the stone railing, looking out at the glittering skyline of Manhattan. He handed me a glass of water. Not champagne. He knew me. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I took a sip of the water. It tasted clean. "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel light, like I have been carrying a backpack full of rocks for 20 years, and someone just cut the straps." "You did good, Samira," he said. "You stood tall." "Did I?" I looked at him. "I sent my parents to prison. Elias, I humiliated them in front of the world. Is that justice? Or is that just cruelty?" "It is accountability," he said firmly. "Cruelty is what they did to you. They took a child and turned her into a spreadsheet. You just balanced the books." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was grounding, a reminder that I was real, that I was more than the sum of my trauma. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. "We can go." "Just walk out, leave the party, leave the mess." "No," I said, looking back into the ballroom where his friends were dancing badly to the music. "I paid for this party. I paid for every flower, every bottle of wine, every hour of the band's time. It is mine. I am going to enjoy it." I felt a vibration in the pocket of my dress. I pulled out my phone. The screen was lit up with notifications. The news had broken. Twitter trending Hawthorne. Fall, CNBC. Alert, Hawthorne. Global stock plummets 60% in after-hours trading following CEO arrest. New York Times. Tax break bride. The wedding that took down a dynasty. I scrolled through the headlines. The world was eating it up. The schadenfreude was delicious and universal. People love to see giants fall, especially giants who have been stepping on them for decades. Then, a text message popped up. "Unknown number. You bitch. You ungrateful. Evil bitch. How could you do this to me? I have nowhere to go. Dad's lawyers aren't answering. Send me money. I need $5,000 right now. If you don't send it, I will sell a story to the tabloids about how you used to wet the bed." Beatrice, even at rock bottom, she was trying to dig a basement. She still thought she had leverage. She still thought she could bully me into submission. I looked at the message. A year ago, it would have made my stomach churn. Now, it just looked pathetic. It was the tantrum of a child who had never been told no. I didn't reply. I didn't feel the need to explain. or to justify, or to argue. I simply tapped the block caller button. Block confirmed. It was a small action, but it felt like slamming a heavy door on a drafty room. Silence. Peace. Another vibration. This time, an email. It was from Sarah, my lawyer. The subject line read, "Transfer complete." I opened it. "Dear Samira, the courts have processed the emergency motion. Based on the federal indictment and the evidence of fraud provided by the IRS, the guardianship order has been formally vacated. The deed to the estate has been transferred to Aurora Holdings, as per the default clause in the loan agreement. Furthermore, the frozen assets in the Cayman accounts have been released to you as the verified owner. The funds are clean. You are officially, legally, and financially free. Congratulations." I stared at the screen. The numbers were just pixels, but they represented something tangible: freedom, autonomy, the ability to wake up in the morning and not have to ask permission to exist. "Good news?" Elias asked, watching my face. "The best," I said. "It is done. Everything is in my name, my real name." I put the phone away. I didn't want to look at screens anymore. I wanted to look at life. "Come on," I said, grabbing Elias's hand. "They are playing our song." "We don't have a song," he laughed. "We do now," I said, pulling him back toward the warmth of the ballroom. We walked back inside. The room was different now. It was no longer a stage set for a tragedy. It was just a party. People were laughing real laughter, not the polite, brittle titter of the social elite. Elias's mom was doing the cha-cha with one of my friends from Vanguard. The waiters, realizing the tension was gone, were actually smiling as they poured drinks. I walked onto the dance floor with my husband. He wrapped his arms around me, and we swayed to the music. I rested my head on his shoulder, for the first time in 29 years. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't analyzing the tax implications of the moment. I wasn't wondering if I was performing correctly. I was just Samira. And for tonight, that was enough. But I knew the work wasn't over. Tomorrow, there would be depositions. There would be press conferences. There would be the messy, bureaucratic business of dismantling the Hawthorne empire piece by piece. I would have to visit the prison. I would have to face Richard and Evelyn one last time. Not as a victim, but as the architect of their fate. I wasn't afraid. I had spent my whole life training for this. They had raised a shark in a swimming pool, and they were surprised when I finally bit. "What are you thinking about?" Elias murmured into my hair. "I am thinking," I said, "that I might sell the house. I don't want to live there. Too many ghosts." "What will you do with it?" he asked. "Maybe I will burn it down," I joked. Then I paused. "No, that is wasteful. I think I will turn it into something useful, maybe a school or a shelter, something that actually helps people, instead of just hiding money." "I like that," he said. "The Hawthorne Center for actually. Let's change the name." "Definitely," I said. "The Ravenswood Center sounds much better." We danced until the music stopped. The night ended not with a bang, but with a slow, contented fade. The guests left, hugging me, wishing me well. The staff cleaned up the debris of the dynasty, the broken glass, the abandoned napkins, the silence where the screams had been. I walked out of the Sterling Heights at 2 a.m. I didn't get into a limousine. I didn't get into a town car. Elias and I hailed a yellow cab. "Where to?" the driver asked. "Home," I said. "Brooklyn." As the cab pulled away, I looked back at the hotel one last time. It looked like a castle, looming and grand, but I knew it was just a building, just brick and mortar and overpriced lighting. It held no power over me anymore. I rolled down the window and let the wind hit my face. I took a deep breath. It tasted like gasoline and exhaust fumes and rain. It tasted like victory. The sun that streamed through the window of our Brooklyn apartment the next morning did not feel like any sun I had ever known. For 29 years. Waking up had been a frantic mental audit before my feet even touched the floor. I would catalog my obligations, rehearse my apologies, and brace myself for the inevitable criticism that came with being a Hawthorne. But today, the light was just light. It was warm. It was quiet. It demanded nothing from me. I lay there for 20 minutes, just listening to the sound of the city waking up and the steady rhythm of Elias breathing beside me. There were no frantic text messages. There were no summons to the family estate. The silence was not empty. It was full of possibility. But there was one final door I had to close, one final knot to untie before the rope was truly gone. At 10 in the morning, my phone buzzed. It was a call from the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Richard's defense attorney, a man who sounded like he had aged 10 years in a single night, was requesting a meeting. He said Richard and Evelyn refused to speak to anyone but me. They claimed they had information that would change everything. "You do not have to go," Elias said as I put on my coat. He stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee, looking at me with protective concern. "You won, Samira. Let the lawyers handle the wreckage." "I know I won," I said, buttoning my coat. "But they do not know it yet. They still think this is a negotiation. I need to go down there and show them that the market has closed." The detention center was a stark contrast to the Sterling Heights. There were no chandeliers here, only fluorescent tubes that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. The air smelled of floor wax and stale despair. I checked my purse at the security desk, walked through the metal detector, and was led into a small, windowless visitation room. They brought them in separately, but I asked for them to be together. I wanted them to see each other in their new natural habitat. Richard walked in first. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame, without his tailored Italian suit, without the shoulder pads and the cufflinks. He looked shrunken. His skin was sallow, and his hair, usually coiffed to perfection, was a mess of thinning gray strands. Evelyn followed. She looked worse. Her face was puffy from crying, and she kept picking at her cuticles until they bled. They sat on the other side of the reinforced glass. I picked up the phone receiver. Richard picked up his. "You look terrible, Richard," I said. It was not an insult. It was an observation. "Cut the pleasantries," Richard snapped. His voice was tinny through the receiver, but the arrogance was still there, like a cockroach that survives a nuclear blast. "We have a proposition for you." "Samira," I raised an eyebrow. "I am listening." "We know where the rest of the money is," he said, leaning in close to the glass. "There is another account, in the Cook Islands, $3 million. It is completely off the grid. The feds don't know about it. Joyce didn't find it." He paused, waiting for my eyes to light up with greed. When they didn't, he continued. "We will give you the access codes," he whispered. "Right now. All you have to do is recant. Tell the prosecutor you made a mistake. Tell them you were off your meds and you forged the documents yourself to get attention. If you take the fall, you will get a light sentence. You are young. You can bounce back. But if we go down, we die in here." I looked at Evelyn. She was nodding frantically, her eyes wide with desperate hope. "Please, Samira, $3 million. It is a fortune. You can start over." I stared at them. It was almost impressive, the sheer density of their delusion. They truly believed that money was the only language I spoke, because it was the only language they had ever taught me. "I don't want your money, Richard," I said. "I told you last night, I have plenty." "Everyone wants more money," Richard shouted, slamming his hand against the ledge. The guard behind him took a step forward, but Richard ignored him. "Don't be stupid. This is your last chance to salvage something from this family." "I am here to salvage something," I said calmly. "But it is not money. It is the truth." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small digital audio player. It was an old model, one I had found in a box of old tapes in the attic 3 years ago, labeled Legal Miscellany 1998. "You see," I said, holding the device up to the glass. "When I was raiding your server, I found more than just tax returns. I found your voice memos. You always did love to record your victories. Didn't you, Dad?" Richard's face went pale. He recognized the device. I found a recording from the day you finalized my adoption, I said. Do you remember that day? Because I do. I remember crying because I didn't want to leave. I pressed play. The audio was crackly, but the voices were unmistakable. Voice of Richard. God, that took forever. The judge was a moron. Voice of Evelyn. At least it is done. The deduction is secured for this quarter. Voice of Richard. It cost me $50,000 to shut that woman up. Though, the aunt, what was her name? Elena? Voice of Evelyn. She was annoying, crying about how she promised her sister she would take care of the girl. It was pathetic. Voice of Richard. Everyone has a price. I told her I would bury her in legal fees until she lost her house if she didn't sign the waiver. Poor people are so easy to scare. She took the 10 grand and ran. I clicked stop. The silence in the visitation room was heavier than the concrete walls. Richard stared at the device in my hand as if it were a loaded gun. Evelyn put a hand over her mouth, a small sound of horror escaping her throat. For 29 years. I had believed the story they told me. They told me I was abandoned. They told me my parents died and nobody wanted me. They told me that my extended family was full of drug addicts and criminals who couldn't care for a child. They told me they had rescued me from a life of squalor. Her name was Elena, I said. My voice was shaking, not with fear, but with a grief that had been delayed for 2 decades. She was my mother's sister. She didn't abandon me. She fought for me. I looked at Richard, my eyes burning. You didn't adopt me, I said. You stole me. You bribed a corrupt judge and you threatened a grieving woman who had no money to fight you. You bought me like a piece of furniture because you needed a write-off. She couldn't provide for you, Evelyn stammered, tears streaming down her face. We gave you a mansion. We gave you a future. She would have given me a home. I screamed. It was the first time I had raised my voice. The sound echoed off the glass, raw and primal. I didn't need a mansion. Evelyn, I needed to be loved. I needed to be wanted, not itemized. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I needed to deliver the final blow, and I needed to do it with precision. But that is in the past, I said, my voice dropping back to a lethal calm. And since you are so fond of financial planning, let me tell you about my future investments. I put the recorder back in my pocket. I have already liquidated the assets I seized from you, I said. The yacht, the cars, the vacation homes, and soon, the estate. You can't, Richard whispered. It is done, I said. And I am not keeping a dime of it. I am using the entire sum, every single blood-soaked dollar, to establish a new non-profit foundation. I leaned in, my face inches from the glass. It is called the Elena Rodriguez Legal Defense Fund, I said. It is a dedicated fund to provide high-end legal representation for foster children who are being financially exploited by their guardians. It will help children like me fight people like you. Richard looked as if I had physically struck him. His legacy, the Hawthorne name. The empire he had built on fraud was being erased, and in its place, I was building a monument to the woman he had crushed. You are vindictive, Richard spat. You are cruel. I am efficient, I corrected him. You taught me that. I stood up. The chair scraped against the linoleum floor. Goodbye, Richard. Goodbye, Evelyn. Wait, Evelyn cried, pressing her palms against the glass. Samira, don't leave us. Please, we are old. We will die in here. Then I suggest you make peace with that, I said. I turned my back on them. Samira, Richard roared. You are nothing without me. You are a Hawthorne. That is your name. You hear me? You belong to us. I kept walking. I walked toward the heavy steel door. I could hear them screaming behind me, their voices muffled by the thick glass. A muted chorus of rage and regret. I signaled to the guard. He buzzed the door open. I stepped out into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind me with a heavy, metallic clang that sounded like the closing of a vault. The screaming stopped. I walked through the sterile corridors, past the checkpoints, and out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the parking lot. I took a deep breath. The air tasted sweet. It tasted like my own. 2 hours later, I stood on the balcony of the new townhouse Elias and I had bought in Brooklyn. It was not a mansion, it was narrow, and the floors creaked, and the view was of a brick alleyway. But it was ours. We had paid for it with money we earned. On the small wrought iron table, there was a heavy ceramic ashtray. I held a sheaf of papers in my hand. It was a copy of my original birth certificate, the one Richard had hidden in his safe, the one that listed my name as Samira Rodriguez. Underneath it were the adoption papers, the legal contracts that had bound me to the Hawthorne Corporation for nearly 3 decades. Elias stood beside me, holding a lighter. He didn't say a word. He just handed it to me. I flicked the wheel. The flame jumped to life, dancing in the gentle breeze. I held the corner of the adoption decree to the flame. The paper curled and blackened. The fire ate through the legal jargon, consuming the whereas and the hereby and the in perpetuity. I watched the signatures of Richard and Evelyn Hawthorne turn into ash and float away on the wind. Then I held the birth certificate. I didn't burn that one. I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. That was who I was. That was who I had always been. They say blood is thicker than water, I said, my voice soft, speaking more to the wind than to Elias. People use that phrase to trap you. They use it to make you tolerate poison just because it shares your DNA, or in my case, just because they bought the rights to your DNA. I watched the last of the ash drift down toward the street below. But sometimes, I continued, water is better, clean, clear water that you choose for yourself, the water that washes you clean. I looked at my hand. On my right ring finger, I still wore the Hawthorne family signet ring. It was a heavy gold band with their crest a hawk gripping a snake. Richard had given it to me when I graduated from college. He had told me it was a badge of honor. Now, I saw it for what it was, a shackle, a branding iron. I pulled it off. It left a pale band of skin where it had blocked the sun. I am not a Hawthorne, I said. I am not an asset. I am not a deduction. I looked at Elias. He was smiling at me, a smile full of pride and love and a future that was wide open. I am Samira, I said, and I am free. I walked to the edge of the balcony, below us, on the street corner. There was a storm drain. Dark water was rushing into it from the morning rain. I held the ring over the railing. The gold glinted in the sun one last time. I opened my hand. The ring fell. It tumbled through the air, a golden speck against the brick of the building. It hit the pavement with a tiny, insignificant clink and bounced into the darkness of the sewer grate. Gone. I didn't wait to hear it splash. I turned around. Elias held out his hand. Ready to go inside. Yes, I said. I am starving. Let's make lunch. I took his hand. I turned my back on the city, on the prison, on the ashes of the past. I stepped through the French doors, into the warmth of my messy, imperfect, beautiful home. And as I crossed the threshold, for the first time in my life, I wasn't acting, I wasn't calculating, I was just living. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It has been a long journey from the cold halls of the Hawthorne estate to the warmth of my own freedom, and I am so grateful you stayed with me until the end. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment down below with your country or city. Let's see how far this story has traveled. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please subscribe to the channel BitterSweet Drama Stories. Hit that like button to support us, and smash the hype button to help this story reach even more people who might need to hear that it is never too late to reclaim your life. Stay strong, and see you in the next story.